Sandra Bullock had just finished a busy morning with interviews and rehearsals for her latest movie. She was in a city known for its luxury and high-end shopping, and despite the work piling up, she had a few hours to unwind. In the mood to treat herself, Sandra decided to visit one of the most exclusive boutiques in town, a place that only the wealthiest and most influential people could access. The boutique's large glass doors swung open as she stepped inside. The cool, polished marble floors gleamed under the soft lighting, and the air was filled with the scent of fresh flowers and high-end perfumes. Everything inside the store looked immaculate, from the designer clothes on display to the elegant furniture that lined the walls. As she wandered deeper into the boutique, she could sense the exclusivity of the place. Every corner screamed luxury, with no detail overlooked. It was everything Sandra imagined a high-end store would be. She moved towards a display table where a selection of stunning handbags lay on display. One in particular caught her eye. A sleek, black leather bag that looked both timeless and sophisticated. Sandra picked it up, admiring the craftsmanship and the feel of the leather under her fingertips. She felt a sudden sense of excitement. This was exactly the kind of piece she'd been hoping to find. As she inspected the bag further, a soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, ma'am. Can I help you with anything?" Sandra looked up and saw a well-dressed woman standing nearby. The woman was tall, with sharp features and an expression that didn't seem too friendly. Sandra smiled and nodded politely. "I'm just looking at this bag." "It's beautiful," Sandra said, holding it up for the woman to see. The boutique manager gave Sandra a quick, almost dismissive glance. There was something in her eyes that Sandra couldn't quite place, but it felt off, like the woman was already judging her based on her appearance. "Well, it's a very high-end piece. I'm not sure it's the kind of thing someone like you would want," the manager said, her voice dripping with a sense of superiority. Sandra blinked, taken aback by the manager's comment. It was as though she'd assumed Sandra couldn't afford the bag, or that it was somehow out of her league. But Sandra knew better than to let someone else's opinion ruin her mood. She simply shrugged, offering a polite smile, and moved to the next display. As Sandra moved through the boutique, the manager's cold stare followed her from a distance. Sandra could feel the woman's judgment in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. It wasn't just about the bag. Sandra could tell that the manager was sizing her up, evaluating her worth based on her appearance, and not on anything else. The boutique manager made no effort to offer assistance as Sandra casually browsed through the racks of dresses, looking at each piece with interest. But there was something about the manager's presence that made Sandra feel out of place, as though she didn't belong in the luxurious store despite her celebrity status. It was an unsettling feeling, and Sandra couldn't help but wonder why the manager seemed so determined to make her feel unwelcome. For a moment, Sandra almost considered leaving. But no, she had come here to relax, to enjoy a bit of time for herself. She was going to let this woman's attitude slide. Or so she hoped. Sandra continued to walk through the boutique, her eyes scanning the high-end clothes and accessories. She had always loved fashion, and even though she was used to being in the spotlight, shopping in a place like this made her feel like she was just another person, trying to find something beautiful and unique. But the longer she stayed, the more she could feel the manager's presence hovering around her. The woman was clearly watching her every move, and Sandra couldn't shake the feeling that she was being judged for something she wasn't even aware of. As Sandra stopped to examine a delicate silk scarf, the manager approached her again. This time, her tone was sharper, almost condescending. "That piece, though lovely, might be a bit too bold for your usual taste, don't you think?" she asked, her eyes scanning Sandra's outfit as if she was trying to dissect her style. Sandra felt a knot form in her stomach. It wasn't the first time someone had criticized her fashion choices, but this felt different. It wasn't just about the scarf, it was about who she was. The manager seemed to be insinuating that Sandra, despite her fame, didn't belong in such a high-end boutique. Sandra took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. She had dealt with her fair share of judgmental people in her career, but this was starting to feel personal. She politely shook her head, holding up the scarf in front of her. "I think it's lovely," Sandra replied with a smile, though she could feel the manager's gaze lingering on her, not quite convinced. The manager didn't respond right away. Instead, she glanced at the other shoppers in the store, perhaps wondering if they had noticed the exchange. Sandra, feeling a mix of frustration and curiosity, tried to focus on the scarves in front of her. She picked up another one, hoping to move past the awkward interaction. But the manager wasn't finished. She seemed determined to keep the conversation going, even if it was at Sandra's expense. "Sometimes people think they can just pick anything up here," the manager said, this time louder, as if making sure everyone in the boutique could hear her. "But these aren't just any scarves. These are designer pieces. You have to have the right eye for them." Sandra's face reddened, and she couldn't help but feel a surge of irritation. It was clear now that the manager wasn't just talking about scarves. She was making it clear that Sandra didn't belong here. Sandra, however, wasn't the type to back down. She'd faced critics and naysayers her whole life, and while this situation was uncomfortable, she wasn't going to let this woman get the better of her. She smiled again, though this time there was a hint of determination in her expression. "I have a good eye for things. Believe me," Sandra said, her voice steady but firm. "And I'm just looking like everyone else." The manager's lips twitched into a thin smile, as if she were silently acknowledging that Sandra had answered back. But her next words were just as sharp as before. "Of course, if you really knew fashion, you'd understand that the best things aren't always the most obvious choices," she said, adding a slight pause before continuing. "But I suppose that's something you have to learn." Sandra felt the sting of those words, but she refused to let them show. She had been in the public eye long enough to know how to handle situations like this, even when they made her feel small. It was just a boutique, just another person trying to make herself feel important. But as she walked away from the manager, Sandra couldn't shake the feeling that she had been humiliated in front of everyone else. The woman's sharp words still echoed in her mind, and she felt herself wishing she could just leave and forget the whole experience. However, she wasn't about to let one person ruin her day. No, Sandra would finish her visit to the boutique, and she would do it on her own terms. As Sandra made her way to the back of the boutique, she couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling the manager had left her with. It was clear the woman was still watching her, ready to pounce at any moment. Sandra sighed and tried to push the thoughts aside. She had come here to relax, to enjoy a peaceful moment away from the pressures of work, not to feel judged or out of place. She browsed through the clothing racks, her fingers lightly brushing against luxurious fabrics, but nothing seemed to spark her interest anymore. Her mind was elsewhere, focused on the tension in the air. Just then, the door to the boutique opened, and a man walked in. Sandra didn't notice him at first, too caught up in her own thoughts. But as he made his way into the store, she couldn't help but feel a shift in the atmosphere. The air seemed to lighten, and a sense of calm washed over her. She looked up and instantly recognized him, Keanu Reeves. Keanu's calm, easygoing demeanor was unmistakable, and it instantly stood in stark contrast to the cold, tense energy of the boutique. His presence filled the room with a certain warmth that made Sandra feel more at ease. He didn't seem to care about the luxury around him. He wasn't the type to be impressed by anything, but there was something about him that drew people in. Sandra felt a small smile tug at the corners of her lips as she watched him. As Keanu walked past her, his eyes met hers, and he gave her a friendly, reassuring smile. Sandra's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just that he was famous. It was how genuine he was. His kindness was evident in the way he carried himself. She returned his smile, a bit relieved by the friendly gesture. Keanu continued to move through the boutique, looking around at the various pieces with an air of quiet curiosity. He seemed perfectly at home in the store, but not in the way the manager expected. He wasn't trying to show off or impress anyone. He simply took in everything around him with interest and respect. Then, as if he had sensed the tension, Keanu turned and noticed the manager. She had been watching Sandra closely, her posture rigid as if waiting for another opportunity to strike. When the manager saw Keanu, her expression shifted from one of superiority to one of surprise and almost immediate respect. Keanu's presence seemed to demand it. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He didn't need to boast or posture. There was no arrogance about him. Instead, there was something incredibly disarming about the way he interacted with others. As he made his way over to Sandra, his expression softened, and he greeted her with a casual but genuine, "Hi, Sandra." It was clear that he knew her. He had always been down to earth, even in the presence of so much fame. His kindness was like a breath of fresh air, and Sandra could feel her anxiety from earlier start to fade away. Keanu stopped beside her, and the boutique manager, now visibly flustered by his sudden appearance, tried to approach. But before she could say anything, Keanu gave her a pointed look, and with quiet authority, made it clear that Sandra deserved to be treated with respect, just like anyone else in the store. There was no need for the manager's behavior to continue, and Keanu made that known without a single word of confrontation. Sandra felt a wave of relief wash over her, not just because of Keanu's presence, but because of the way he stood up for her without hesitation. She couldn't help but feel thankful that, in that moment, someone had noticed what was going on and took the time to make things right. It was a simple act, but to Sandra, it meant the world. The boutique, which had once felt so cold and intimidating, now felt a little more welcoming, simply because of one person's kindness. As Keanu turned to smile at her once more, Sandra felt something shift within herself. She was no longer worried about the manager's judgment. With Keanu beside her, she knew everything would be okay. Sandra felt a sense of calm as Keanu continued to stand beside her, offering silent support. The boutique, once a place of judgment and discomfort, now felt different. The atmosphere had shifted in a subtle yet undeniable way. Sandra realized that the simple act of someone standing up for her had made a huge difference. She had been so caught up in the manager's cold treatment, but now, with Keanu by her side, the situation didn't feel so overwhelming anymore. The manager, who had previously exuded an air of superiority, now seemed awkward and unsure of herself. Sandra noticed how the manager's eyes darted nervously between Keanu and herself. There was a clear tension in the air, but it wasn't the same tension that Sandra had felt earlier. It was now the manager who felt uncomfortable. Sandra couldn't help but feel a small sense of triumph. It was clear that Keanu's presence was a powerful thing, and the manager had no choice but to acknowledge that. Keanu, as always, remained calm and composed. He didn't need to say anything more. His quiet, unwavering confidence spoke for itself. He turned back to Sandra, giving her an encouraging smile. "Take your time," he said, his voice gentle and reassuring. "There's no rush." Sandra smiled back, grateful for the warmth he was offering her. For the first time since entering the boutique, she felt like she could breathe again. The pressure she had been feeling was slowly fading away, replaced by a sense of freedom. She had come to the boutique to enjoy some time to herself, and now she finally felt like she could. Keanu's kindness was something she hadn't expected, but it was something she truly appreciated. It wasn't just about him being a famous actor. It was about the way he treated people with genuine respect. Sandra had spent enough time in the public eye to know when someone was being kind just because it was the right thing to do. Keanu wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply being himself, and that was enough to make Sandra feel seen and heard. The manager, now understanding that her behavior was no longer being tolerated, took a step back. Sandra noticed how she tried to smooth things over, offering her a nervous smile and a polite, almost forced, "Let me know if you need anything else." Sandra could see through the manager's thin veneer of politeness. There was no real warmth behind her words, but Sandra wasn't interested in her apology anymore. The damage had been done, and the manager's behavior had already shown Sandra what kind of person she was. She didn't need to seek approval from someone like that. "Thank you," Sandra said, her voice steady. "I'll let you know if I need help." With that, The manager scurried off, leaving Sandra and Keanu in the quiet corner of the boutique. Sandra couldn't help but chuckle softly at how quickly the power dynamics had shifted. She had been made to feel like an outsider in the boutique, but now, with Keanu's support, she was back in control of the situation. Keanu glanced over at Sandra with a small smile. "It's all about standing up for what's right," he said, his tone light but sincere. Sandra nodded, feeling a rush of gratitude towards him. "You have no idea how much this means to me," she said, her voice soft. "Thank you for stepping in." Keanu simply shrugged, his smile widening. "No need to thank me, just doing the right thing." His humility was just as evident as his kindness, and Sandra couldn't help but admire it. She realized, in that moment, that it wasn't just the boutique or the manager that had made her uncomfortable. It was the feeling of being treated like she didn't belong. But with Keanu's help, that feeling had vanished. She was no longer worried about the opinions of others. She was in control again. With a renewed sense of confidence, Sandra continued browsing the boutique, enjoying the luxury of taking her time. Keanu, always respectful of her space, wandered off to another part of the store, leaving her to enjoy the rest of her visit. Sandra felt at ease for the first time that day, and she couldn't help but smile to herself. As Sandra continued to browse through the boutique, the weight of the earlier tension seemed to melt away. With Keanu by her side, even though he wasn't hovering over her, she felt like she could breathe easier. The boutique that had once seemed so cold and exclusive now felt a little more welcoming. The items that she had previously glanced over with uncertainty now felt like they were there for her to enjoy, without judgment. She picked up a stunning dress, its delicate fabric catching the light as she held it up. The intricate design and the soft, flowing lines made her feel drawn to it, as if it were made for someone like her. But as she looked at the price tag, a wave of doubt crept in. It was an expensive piece, one she hadn't expected to find, but something about it felt right. She held it up against herself, admiring the way it draped. Just then, Keanu wandered over to her, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. He had always had a way of making everything feel less intimidating, like he had no need to impress anyone. He gave her a friendly glance, his eyes soft with understanding. "That's a beautiful dress," he said with a warm smile. "It suits you." Sandra looked at him, surprised by how genuine his compliment was. It wasn't just a polite remark. It was a simple, honest observation. She smiled back, feeling a little lighter. "I think it's perfect," Sandra said softly. "But I'm not sure if I should. You know, it's a bit pricey." Keanu shrugged, his demeanor still as calm as ever. "Sometimes, the things that make us feel good are worth it. It's not about the price. It's about what makes you happy." Sandra paused, considering his words. She had always been cautious when it came to spending money, especially when it was something as extravagant as this. But in that moment, she realized that maybe Keanu was right. There was no point in holding back if something truly made her feel special. "I think you're right," she said, her voice soft with a sense of decision. She placed the dress in her arms, feeling a new sense of freedom wash over her. The manager's judgment and the strange atmosphere in the store no longer mattered. She was no longer going to let anything hold her back from doing something for herself. Keanu smiled, giving her an approving nod, as if he knew exactly what was going through her mind. "It's good to treat yourself once in a while," he added, his words filled with that same easygoing wisdom. As they moved through the boutique, Sandra felt a shift within herself. It wasn't just about the clothes or the shopping. It was about reclaiming her space and her right to enjoy things without fear of judgment. For the first time in a long time, Sandra felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The manager, who had been watching from a distance, seemed to sense that things were no longer going her way. Her posture was tense, her movements stiff as she fumbled with a display. Sandra couldn't help but notice the way the manager's expression shifted when she saw the dress in Sandra's hands. There was a moment of hesitation, as though she couldn't quite believe that someone like Sandra was confident enough to purchase something so expensive. But instead of letting that negativity bother her, Sandra simply smiled and continued with her shopping. Keanu, noticing her subtle shift in mood, leaned over and whispered, "You've got this. You don't need anyone else's approval." Those simple words were all Sandra needed to hear. She didn't need the boutique manager's approval, and she didn't need anyone else to tell her she deserved the finer things in life. She had earned this moment, this small act of treating herself, without apology. And with that thought in mind, Sandra moved forward with confidence, her head held high. The rest of her time in the boutique passed in a calm, pleasant flow. Sandra found a few more items that caught her eye, and Keanu, ever the supportive friend, happily offered his opinion when asked. He wasn't just a celebrity. He was a person who understood the value of kindness and respect, and Sandra appreciated that more than anything. As the two of them made their way to the checkout, Sandra felt a sense of accomplishment. She had stood her ground, made her own choices, and walked out of the boutique feeling like she truly belonged. And it was all thanks to a chance encounter with someone who wasn't afraid to be kind when it mattered most. As Sandra walked up to the counter with the beautiful dress in her hands, she couldn't help but feel a sense of empowerment. The day had started with frustration and discomfort, but now, after everything that had happened, she was leaving the boutique with a renewed sense of self-assurance. The price tag that had initially caused hesitation no longer seemed important. It wasn't about the cost of the dress. It was about choosing something that made her feel good, something that was for her and no one else. Keanu, standing by her side, seemed completely at ease, as if nothing in the world could shake his calm presence. He had made all the difference today, not just by standing up for her in front of the manager, but by offering her simple, kind words when she needed them most. His quiet confidence had allowed Sandra to let go of the doubts and fears that had been holding her back. As the cashier rang up her purchase, Sandra glanced over at Keanu. "I'm really glad you were here today," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I wasn't sure how things were going to go when I walked in, but you made everything feel so much easier." Keanu smiled, his eyes warm and genuine. "I'm just happy I could help. You don't need to apologize for being yourself, Sandra. You deserve to feel good about your choices, just like anyone else." Sandra nodded, appreciating his words more than he could possibly know. In a world where people often felt the need to be perfect or meet certain expectations, Keanu had reminded her that it was okay to simply be herself, to make decisions that felt right without worrying about judgment. The cashier handed Sandra the bag with the dress inside, and as she took it, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. The discomfort she had felt earlier, the awkwardness of being judged, had completely disappeared. She was leaving this boutique as the same person who had walked in, but somehow she felt lighter, stronger, and more confident. Keanu, sensing the shift in her mood, gave her a reassuring smile. "You ready to get out of here? I think we've earned a little time to just relax." Sandra laughed softly. "I'd like that," she said, feeling a smile tug at her lips. She hadn't realized just how much she needed a moment to unwind after the stressful start to her visit. "Maybe we can grab some coffee or something." "Coffee sounds perfect," Keanu replied with his usual calm. "There's a great place just down the street. We can sit, chat, and let everything settle." Sandra felt the weight of the day lift off her shoulders as they walked out of the boutique together. The air outside felt fresher, more open, and as they made their way down the street, Sandra felt a deep sense of gratitude for the kindness Keanu had shown her. She had expected a quiet shopping trip, but instead, she had walked away with something far more valuable. The reminder that kindness and support could come when she least expected it, from the most unlikely of places. As they sat down at a small cafe a few minutes later, Sandra realized that sometimes the most difficult experiences could lead to unexpected lessons. She had gone into the boutique feeling unsure of herself, feeling judged and uncomfortable. But now she felt like she had regained control. She didn't need to impress anyone or fit into anyone's idea of what she should be. With Keanu's help, She had simply been herself, and that was enough. They sat there for a while, chatting about everything and nothing, letting the small, quiet moments of connection pass between them. Keanu was a man who didn't need to be the center of attention, who didn't rely on fame or status to make an impact. His kindness was something that came naturally, and it was something Sandra knew she would always remember. By the time they finished their coffee, the stress of the boutique was nothing more than a distant memory. Sandra walked away from the cafe with her head held a little higher, feeling like she had truly turned a corner that day. And though it had started out as just a simple trip to the store, it had turned into something far more meaningful, a reminder that no matter how small the act, kindness could make all the difference. The afternoon sun was beginning to set as Sandra and Keanu walked out of the cafe, both feeling more relaxed than when they had entered. The earlier tension had evaporated entirely, replaced by a quiet peace that hung in the air around them. The street was bustling with people enjoying the late afternoon, and the soft sounds of conversation and distant music created a calm backdrop. As they strolled down the sidewalk, Sandra couldn't help but feel a growing sense of contentment. Today had turned out so much better than she had expected. For the first time in a while, Sandra felt a sense of freedom that had eluded her in recent months. She had spent so much time focused on her career, the demands of the public, and trying to maintain an image that sometimes it was hard to remember who she really was. But today, with Keanu's quiet support, she had rediscovered something important: the ability to be herself, to trust her instincts, and to enjoy the simple pleasures of life without fear of judgment. "Thank you again for everything," Sandra said as they continued walking. "I didn't expect the day to turn out like this, but I'm really grateful you were here." Keanu smiled, his expression gentle and understanding. "I'm glad I could help. You didn't need anyone to fix anything, Sandra. You just needed someone to remind you that you're doing fine as you are." His words made Sandra pause for a moment. She looked at him, genuinely touched by his kindness. Keanu had a way of making everything feel simple, as if the complexities of life could be solved by just being kind to one another and staying true to who you are. There was something calming about his presence, and Sandra realized that it wasn't just about today. It was about the way he lived his life, always present, always genuine. They continued walking for a while longer, passing by shops and cafes, the evening air growing cooler. Sandra's thoughts drifted back to the boutique, and she found herself feeling a bit more confident. It wasn't just about the clothes or the experience of shopping. It was about the way she had taken control of her own space in the world without needing anyone's approval. As they neared the end of the street, Keanu turned to her with a smile. "You know, there's a beautiful park just around the corner. If you're up for it, we could take a walk. Sometimes the best thing to do is just get some fresh air and enjoy the moment." Sandra looked at him, feeling a sense of ease. It had been a long time since she had simply taken a walk for the sake of enjoying the day. She agreed with a smile, and together they turned down the side street that led to the park. The park was quiet, the sound of birds and rustling leaves filling the air. It was a peaceful place, away from the noise of the city, where Sandra could let her thoughts settle. She walked alongside Keanu, feeling the weight of the day's earlier events slowly fade away. "I've been thinking," Sandra began, her voice thoughtful. "I've been in this business for so long, always worried about how people see me, what they think. I guess I forgot that it's okay to just be, to not worry about fitting into someone else's idea of who I should be." Keanu glanced at her, his smile kind and knowing. "You're right. We often get caught up in what others think, but in the end, it's our own peace and happiness that matter the most. It's easy to forget that, especially when the world around you is constantly telling you who you should be." Sandra nodded, feeling a sense of clarity. It was as if the conversation, the moments shared with Keanu, had given her the space to breathe again. She no longer felt the need to conform or to seek validation from anyone. She was her own person, and that was enough. The walk through the park continued in comfortable silence, both of them lost in their thoughts but content in each other's company. Sandra realized that, even though she had spent the day trying to navigate the complexities of judgment and expectations, the simplest moments, like this walk with Keanu, were the ones that truly mattered. The weight of the world felt a little lighter with every step she took, and for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace with herself. By the time they reached the end of the park, the sun had set, and the streetlights were beginning to flicker on. The world around them seemed quieter now, the noise of the day having faded into the background. Sandra felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the day itself, but for the reminder that kindness, understanding, and the ability to just be present with someone could make all the difference. "I think I'm ready to go home now," Sandra said, her voice calm and content. But today, it was perfect. Keanu smiled, his eyes reflecting the same sense of peace. "I'm glad you think so. You deserve to have more days like this." With that, they both walked back toward their separate paths, knowing that the day had. As Sandra walked back to her car, she felt an unexpected sense of fulfillment. The day that had started with discomfort and uncertainty had transformed into something far more meaningful. The boutique, the manager's judgment, and even the awkwardness she had felt when she first walked in seemed like distant memories now. All that remained was the quiet, comforting presence of Keanu, his words still echoing in her mind. "You deserve to feel good about your choices, just like anyone else." It was a reminder she would carry with her long after this day was over. She reached her car and paused for a moment, taking a deep breath of the evening air. The coolness of the night felt refreshing against her skin, and for the first time in a while, she felt truly at ease. The world outside seemed to slow down, and for a brief moment, Sandra didn't think about the constant rush of her career or the expectations that always weighed on her shoulders. She just allowed herself to be present in the moment. Keanu had made all the difference today, not with grand gestures or dramatic actions, but with his quiet kindness and gentle support. He hadn't just defended her from the manager. He had reminded her of something important, that she didn't need to prove herself to anyone. She didn't need to bend to anyone's standards of what was acceptable or worthy. All she had to do was be true to herself. As she sat in the car, preparing to head home, Sandra reflected on everything that had happened. She thought about how often she had been caught up in what others expected of her, whether it was the roles she played, the way she looked, or the way people perceived her. There had always been some level of pressure. But today, for the first time in a long time, she had stepped outside of those pressures. She had made decisions for herself, not because of what others thought, but because it felt right. And that was powerful. Keanu's words stayed with her as she drove. He had said it wasn't about the price of the dress, but about the joy it brought. It wasn't about impressing anyone or seeking approval. It was about embracing her own happiness. And that had made all the difference. When Sandra arrived home, the evening had already settled into a peaceful quiet. The lights in her home greeted her, and as she stepped inside, she felt a wave of comfort wash over her. The place she called home had always been a sanctuary, but tonight, it felt even more so. She set down the bag with the dress, her mind still processing everything she had experienced. She went to the window, looking out at the city below, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment. There was something profoundly satisfying about taking control of her own narrative, of standing up for herself, and realizing that her value wasn't determined by anyone else's standards. She was enough just as she was. Sandra knew that, while today had been a turning point, it wasn't a single moment that defined her. It was a lesson that would continue to shape her journey. She didn't need anyone to define her worth. She had already done that for herself. The feeling of being seen and respected, not for her fame but for her character, had been more important than anything else that day. She smiled softly, realizing how much she had learned from the experience. It wasn't just about standing up to judgment. It was about embracing who she was, flaws and all, and being proud of that person. As Sandra sat down to relax for the night, she felt lighter, not because the world around her had changed, but because her perception of herself had shifted. She was enough. She always had been. And that was all that truly mattered. The day had been full of surprises, but the most important one was the reminder that sometimes the best thing you can do is simply be yourself.